This is our speaker today, Mr. Bryan Hurd.
Oh, hey, thanks. So,
I'm not going to shut the doors because it's going to get too hot here. So.
yeah, seriously. And thank you for coming out, and thanks for the Black Lodge Research for not only what they're doing today, but the lock sporting event they put on just before this, and also the various programs they have for high school students and others who are experimenting with robotics. They're building some rockets back there, as well as the standard 3D printing, hacking and other stuff, and trying to figure out how things work. So from a fellow tinkerer, thanks for helping the next generation. My name's Bryan Hurd. We're going to go through what I hope to be a very interactive brief today. So I'm going to talk about some old cases. I've been doing this for a little while, about 25 years. And I'm going to talk on the strategy side. If you want to get into the bolts of a particular case or a particular vulnerability, hey, let's take it offline, because a lot of people either, depending on the level, will be either not wanting to or wanting to get into that. So what I'm going to do is just go through a couple areas, like talk a little bit about why I get the privilege of standing up in front of a room of people like you, going in the Wayback Machine and talking about some cases I worked and the nation worked about 20 years ago that are really indicative of the stuff we're still seeing today. Also, I'll talk about the cyber threat environment. For those of you that haven't been on the dark web, brought a screenshot or two. And then I probably may or may not get to some future predictions. And for those of you that have been on the dark web, these are the easy sites. So there's, again, mix in the audience. And we'll talk about that. I've had a very fortunate existence in my career. I was the founder of the Cyber Counterintelligence program at the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. How many of you have ever seen the TV show NCIS? Great. Yeah, we weren't that thin, and we can't solve crimes in 42 minutes minus commercials. So the two characters that are based off of me are the girl with the tattoos and the agent that gets in trouble all the time. I called two of my friends who are the advisors, and they're like, yeah, that was kind of based after you. I'm like, I'm not getting royalties, am I? He goes, no, but I am. So very good friend. Also worked at National Counterterrorism Center. I was running innovation for the US Watchlisting System, what you all know as the no-fly list, and worked some of the operations and case management on a Boston attack. Also, what I thought was an identity theft phone call really was an executive recruiter for Microsoft. So the next thing you know, I live in Redmond. So I live here in Kirkland and have been a member of the local community about 6 years now. If there's any executives in the audience, the whole same thing in pictures, because executives don't read. So those are the logos of the various companies I've had the privilege to work for. As this has gone international, and I see a lot of Russian on the online version of the speech today, I have to put up the disclaimer for my company. Any bad opinions are not the company's. Any good opinions are the company's. And my children and parents have disavowed all knowledge of anything I'll say today either. So there's a continuing education credit, I don't know if you knew this, in the DC206 program. So they asked me to put in one small test at the beginning, but don't worry, because of a language barrier, it's a math test. So please get a pencil ready, pick one of the following and solve it in the next 60 seconds.
42, -1.
Close, actually really close, but not really. E equals MC squared. Any intelligent fool can make things bigger and more complex. It takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to take in the opposite direction. One of the biggest problems I've seen in our community when we go to brief decision makers and executives and secretaries of defense is we keep trying to teach them how a firewall is configured. It is a challenge to us not to dumb it down. And this is an important distinction, especially for those of you who stand in front of boards of directors. You're not dumbing it down, you're leveling it up. And there's a big difference, and they can tell if they're being talked down to or if they're being talked up to. The same thing is easily in our community. It's easy to throw a bunch of technical terms and watch everybody in the room's eyes glaze over because they can't understand what we're talking about. But we have to translate why this ransomware is hurting the business, why this vulnerability is worth $5,000 or a $10,000 or a $10 million program to make sure it doesn't hurt our customers. And that is the big challenge. It's translating the immense knowledge each of you have into something the business can consume, because they've been doing that for 30 years. And it's been a challenge in my career, but it's been an area that my English to English translation skills are called upon again and again for that one reason. And I have teams of immensely smart people with 2 and 3 PhDs. So, how many of you remember a guy named Cliff Stoll? So I've had the privilege of talking to Cliff about 2 or 3 times. For those of you that think Russians, and hello to all my friends in Russia on the webcast, y'all remember this case. Back in 1998, East German hackers, and for those of you a little younger, there used to be an East Germany, consult your history books or Wikipedia. East German KGB was running West German hackers, and they were culling through research systems in the United States. Cliff Stoll, an astronomer whose grant was out and needed a job at the People's Republic of Berkeley, also known as UC Berkeley. Any graduates? Okay, just checking. He was tasked to look at the accounting systems on the mainframe systems. Again, for younger kids, mainframes are like cloud computing. It's the same thing, really. You get charged like 2 cents per minute or something. And he found he was doing an A/B test on accounting systems, and found in one system he had an account that wasn't in the other system called Hunter. And there were 75 cents different in the billing. And then he found out these hackers that were coming through his system were targeting the United States government. So he called the FBI. And they said, well, what's the financial damage? And he goes, so far we're up to 75 cents. And they hung up the phone. So after the investigation, and Jim Christie, U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigations, Jim's a great friend, Kevin Mandia and many others at the time were involved in the investigation. Myself came in a little bit later after this, a couple years. We looked at the ragged edge of this. Found out these hackers were in the employ of the KGB. Now, one of the hackers, so distraught over his upcoming trial in West Germany, went over to East Germany and committed suicide by removing his own shoes and leaving them somewhere off-site, tying his hands behind his back, beating himself profusely about the head with a large blunt object, probably a cinder block, and then hung himself from a tree and set himself on fire, in that order. It was deemed suicide by the Stasi. Well, that was very impressive.
I was going to ask about if you knew anything about that, but...
It was one of the, and please excuse the following statement, because to those that haven't done like law enforcement, it was one of the funniest autopsies I've ever read. It's an odd statement, but there's some gallows humor within the law enforcement community. Another early case, Moonlight Maze. 20 years ago this year, or just last year, attackers, Russian hackers, hi guys, going through the US system, stealing research information. And again, they were taking unclassified information a lot of times because the systems of 10 years from now are unclassified at this time. And one thing about this was, now it's old school, or it's easy to say, oh, they observe Chinese holidays or Russian holidays or things like that. I was sitting with a gentleman whose name will remain off the briefing, but he's a good friend. He was sitting there and we were looking at a calendar with a highlighter, and we were trying to pick the dates and times that the people were attacking us and figuring out how many people there were by their Unix skills or by the way they were coding. So the ideas of fingerprinting a hacker or observing time zones or observing holidays, and they weren't coming from IPs in that area. It wasn't that easy. They were jumping through a third country, so we had an offset. We had to take a time zone of a workday and move it all around the planet. And by the way, for those of you a little younger, this was pretty much, there was not a World Wide Web until 95. It wasn't really a big thing until 98, 99. There wasn't any Googling this. We were figuring this out all on our own. We had to find manuals and things like that.
There wasn't any GeoIP back then either.
No, there was no GeoIP. The spiders from all the search engines, which were unknown to us, were scraping the internet, and they looked just like adversarial activity. So the one thing about this case was, at the time, it was the world's largest intellectual property theft, but we couldn't figure out what they were taking. So I had to go find new analytic technologies that didn't exist to analyze what now seems trite, terabytes of data. That used to be a big thing, to have a terabyte. We actually had to fly around the country to get the CDs of the log files for this case. Had to get on a plane, have them burn it to CDs, and we would bring back boxes and boxes of CDs in a seat next to us on a commercial aircraft. So this is called Spire from Pacific Northwest National Labs. It takes 10,000 or more documents and gives you a mountainscape of their topics and lets you drill down. Because I couldn't tell what was stolen. I had people querying into it and giving me bad information. I needed the data to tell me what it was, not me to tell it what it was. Analyst Notebook from I2, we used a lot of that. And this is what's called Starlight, another tool from Pacific Northwest National Labs to allow us to look at geocoded data, image data, schematics, and other things, all in one view to figure out what the adversary was doing. So these were the kind of challenges we faced 20 years ago when we were looking at the cases, as well as figuring out the StatD vulnerabilities and other things like that. Another case we had back in '98 was just after we did an attack. There were 2 attacks on embassies in Africa, and we traced it back to a terrorist camp in Yemen. And then after that attack, I was on the defensive side at NCIS, as well as on the working offense, and we wanted to know how quickly could you figure out who did the attack. So I took somebody who was not a hacker, my dad, who was an accountant and knew very little about computers. He could surf the web. And I gave him the site on CNN to start with. Within 20 minutes, he could go from the site to it said, here's the Navy's homepage, here are the list of Navy ships, here's the ships in the area, here's the missile destroyer, here's the names of everybody on it, and the bio of the CEO where he tells you his kids' names. Then we used whitepages.com, which, by the way, 1, still exists, 2, is here in Seattle. So whitepages.com to get home addresses. We had pictures from the ship's homepage and a schedule of the ship, which was secret, no foreign at the time, and a base of the map and where all the dog walk parks are, and prove that you could go and find, I know what the CEO's dog looks like, or the commanding officer, the CEO's dog, and his children look like, and I know their name and I know the dog's name. So the Navy rejiggered its homepages. The Army shut down its homepages for about 6 months based on me briefing this to the Secretary of Defense. And again, none of this is a vulnerability in a piece of software of the Navy. It was a vulnerability in the business process of how we let information out. Yeah, open source intelligence, or OSINT, is what was mentioned by one of the attendees. One of my other favorite cases was in 2000 in Australia. A disgruntled employee hacked back into the waste management system, opened up a valve, and dumped 800,000 liters of raw sewage into the local Marriott and Park. So what a load of BS, literally. The reason this is one of my favorite cases, everybody's like, well, OT's a thing. OT's been a thing. Where have you been? The employee made 46 attempts to hack in. They had issues with the way the systems were communicating. They were running diagnostics. They couldn't figure it out. They found the guy. They did a traffic stop and found him war dialing and driving around with all his computer equipment in his car. He hacked in 46 times and caused a great deal of damage by dumping the raw sewage out because he was a disgruntled employee. So not only removing access of a departing employee, but understanding and having the instrumentation to know when somebody smart is messing with your pumps, with your switches, and your operational technology. So what does that translate to? Our new reality. Cybercrime is evolving, and I'll talk about some more cases, and we can do interactive stuff too. Global organized crime rings have embraced cybercrime. I just returned from Garmisch, Germany, speaking to 100 representatives of 53 nations on how to combat transnational organized crime. And they're all in various countries all across Africa, Europe, Asia, a lot of island countries, trying to do what we did back 25 years ago and found a program for cyber protection of their nation, or for their police forces, or for their judiciary. So what we may take for granted, being here in Redmond and with the amount of amazing intelligence we have just in this room, many countries are just trying to figure this out at this point. And they need people like us to help them in a very regimented way. Also, I will talk a little bit about botnets and stuff like that. What we need is coordination on fighting these types of things. What is your life going to look like? I just came back from talking with the deputy CIO of Los Angeles about connected cities. And here's what your commute to work could look like. You leave your home in an app-driven car, go to your home or school, your groceries are dropped off in your trunk by Amazon. You then either rent that or a different conveyance to get home. You may rent a scooter. You may go to a hub. What they're trying to have is one app and say, I want to get from here to here. And it tells you what car, train, scooter, and bicycle you can use to get through your day or vacation. And there are a bunch of companies doing it. There's a lot of mega trends in the auto industry of electrification, autonomy, connectivity, mobility. These are the things that are going to be in our everyday life, in our cars, in our refrigerators, in other places. There are levels of automation. For those of you that are in the community for a while, the SAE levels, we're somewhere around driver assistance and partial automation. We've got some time to go before we get to higher full automation. Well, what does that translate to? The connectivity of an automobile, The connectivity of an automobile comes in many flavors: vehicle to infrastructure, vehicle to network, vehicle to vehicle, pedestrian, device, grid, everything. IVI, in-vehicle infotainment. Each of these cloud connected 24/7, each of them built by the cheapest bidder, each of them not really built for security because they want to be first to market. Now, for those of you that want to know what companies are doing it, here you go. That's a 3-second slide. If that's a little complex, here's what it looks like when they talk to each other or the mergers that are underway. How about being the CISO for that? So one of the case studies that we did was looking at this in-vehicle infotainment. We basically tore the thing apart. We found hard-coded server credentials, AWS keys, database passwords, all left in the code. This is Mark 1 Mod 0, just good hygiene on your code, your security, the reusability of it, things like that. And this was in some of the in-car entertainment. So I get to work with a lot of our pen test teams on the hardware and software level at Aon, looking at automotive, looking at aeronautic, whatever we're working on. What that means, and this hasn't changed since I used this slide 20 years ago, the required knowledge and skill is decreasing. The power of that one person using one computer to cause damage is increasing. So here's a visualization exercise for each of you. Close your eyes for a second. Picture 10 of your friends, family, and coworkers. Isn't one of them an idiot? That person's going to click on that email. That person's going to get that virus installed. That person's going to pwn you for malware. This is our problem then. It's still our problem now.
Fascinating. I'm going through the process of getting a job. The number of times that I have had enough information to ruin my life in a single page, in a single web request,
Yes.
is astonishing. And I have to actually have physical copies of the same amount of information to ruin my life on my body around probably 100 or so other people coming up very soon with the same amount of information they can ruin their lives.
Right.
Trusting people to not fuck it up.
Yes. So many of you were hit by the Premier hack. How many of you had your medical records compromised? Or the Expedia hack or Equifax where you had your information about your credit. I've had all those. The OPM hack, everything I've told a polygrapher since I was 19 years old is in China. In a database probably better than the one it got stolen from. So one of the things they asked me to do when I was coming out here was, having just come from talking to all the different nations and coming through DC, they said, okay, tell the audiences out in Redmond who the real threat is. So here's the list we put together. The State Department, there are no enemies, only emerging allies. The CIA knows who the enemy is, but telling you would endanger the source. NSA says you're not cleared for that code word. US Marines, doesn't matter, mess with the best, die like the rest. Hoorah. And the FBI thinks it's the CIA. So who is it? And again, to my global audience, hello. China, Russia, Iran. Many countries and many people in them are patriots to their country as much as I'm a patriot to mine. And that's one of the differences about counter-espionage or intelligence collection than counter-drugs, terrorism, or human trafficking. I have a great deal of respect for the intelligence officers and even the hackers on the other side who are in the employ of their government and under the controls of oversight and just trying to do things to enhance their flag. However, they're still a threat to my flag because I like these colors and this array a bit different. We have, please, sir.
I saw I can never find it again. Somebody had done a Gartner Magic Quadrant of the Chinese and the Russians. And then somebody had gone back and added the one missing player on the list was the USA.
Top right.
And put it on that top right, and it's like, I can never find it again, but they're like, you know, a lot of these things miss the fact that the US really should be on that threat thing, and that they're probably more threatening than you realize, but when you're in the US, you tend to not realize or consider them to be a threat factor, but I've never been able to find that.
I would say in the world of international computer security and intelligence, we are a player. The others are threats. But that's all about, again, respectfully submitted, the perspective of the person drawing the map.
Yeah.
So from my perspective, Aldrich Ames, one insider, not with a lot of technical knowledge, had 3.5-inch floppy drive disks. Again, for the younger audience, there used to be diskettes you put in a computer, and it's a thing. Yeah. So, two things. One, Mole Hunters investigated 90 employees. Here's one of my favorite statements. There were so many problem personalities that no one stood out as a suspect. So, when you think, oh, you know, we're going to just investigate and find the problematic people and catch a spy. Yeah, it doesn't work that way. Here's the thing. He was reassigned from counterintelligence over to counter drugs because they had suspicions about him, but they didn't change his shared drive permissions. Need to know, need to know, need to know. Something as simple as an administrative procedure. He was able to continue to compromise cases, and he compromised a couple of mine. So he has a special place in my heart as he stays in jail. Of course, many of you, I'm not even going to go into it, there's a whole hours and hours about this, attacks on the state elections, levering commercial and other cover, troll farms doing things during various elections. This has been going on for 50 years. Voice of America is our version of it. We broadcast radio signals into countries to try and convince them we have a better way of life. I think we're right. I understand they might disagree. But the tools that people are using now are quite different. And why? Because the shadow brokers and other things have compromised tools that used to only be in the hands of people with congressional oversight. And even if it's not on the front page of the Washington Post or the Seattle Times, the US intel community doesn't have half the powers people think they do without going through judges and congressmen and things like that. Worked there for many years. I wish I had all the capabilities that the movies tell us we do. But these groups are now not only taking the tools from the US and putting them out on the web to the highest bidder, they're doing the same thing to the Iranians, oil rig, and others. So when we talk about international malware, when I was chief of intelligence for cybercrime at Microsoft, we do the malware takedowns, where we do botnet takedowns and take over the command and control of those using actual, what I'll call legal innovation, a term you won't hear very often. You won't hear very often out of me. A great team over at Microsoft that I got to lead that was doing this. These are, after we take over the DNS registries, all the infected machines then call into Microsoft asking for orders. And we can't cleanse because if you blue screen 0.001%, you still don't know what that machine's running. So you can't just run around inoculating computers without knowing it. But there are ways that we weaved it into the fabric and try and help these people. So you can see all these computers calling. This is Beijing. Satellites would hit that spike if it was actual. And the rest of this is a heat map of the infections in Europe. But let me ask you a question. If you look at the population of Europe, all the way from Spain, all the way from Moscow, the whole map should be lit up. Why is it not lit up? And where does it stop? Well, I have a question. How does a botnet know where a line is that doesn't actually physically exist? Many of the botnets are programmed not to infect malware with a Cyrillic keyboard settings or other things that indicate you're probably between here and here. the do not call home feature. So these kind of things are not always an indicator, but some of them are. So what's going on with organized crime groups? They're going cyber. Banking Trojans fraud, ransomware is extortion, DDoS protection rackets are just forms of extortion. They're just using new tools. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Also, transnational crimes are not just cyber. Human trafficking, child exploitation, terrorism, drug trafficking, and all those kind of things. And if you ever wanted to know what $200 million looks like all in one pile, there you go. These guys only took half that, so you have to use your imagination and cut the pile in half. The attacks on the banking network, on the SWIFT network, which is the class or the better protected network the banks use to transfer millions and hundreds of millions of dollars, got hit by the Lazarus Group, believing they took about $100 million. So if you were running a business and you took $0 in a couple months and netted $100 million, will your boss let you do it again? And so this is the kind of threat we face. And there's a lot of people that have worked in these systems that really are available to support. And these are not one kid in a basement with a hoodie. These are organized crime groups, hundreds of millions of dollars in assets, hundreds and thousands of people. They have different divisions that write the malware. They have different divisions that deploy it. And we'll talk a little bit about that. The ransomware we're seeing with Ryuk and others, the ransoms are in the 7 digits. 1.5, 1.7, $5 million. It's not just one Bitcoin anymore. I believe them to be looking at the company they've hacked, looking at its yearly income and taking 2 to 3% as a ransom. And they're getting paid. Many of you are painfully familiar with the impact on Maersk of the NotPetya that came out of the Ukraine conflict, where you have information operations tools of a nation state that had impact far beyond what they were intended. They wrote down over $300 million in their annual statement to stockholders because of the impact of that one bit of malware. $300 million, and it's in their financial statements. Organized crime and state actors. Sometimes in the US, there's a lot of rules about who you can use as a confidential informant or a source or a vendor. In other countries, organized crime may bleed in and out of nation-state activities. In the US, that would cause us a problem because then you're responsible for that criminal when they're not working for you. It's a problem. In other states, they don't have that distinction. So you have state-inspired criminal activity. You sometimes have criminal groups supporting the state itself. And one potential example of that, for those of you that are into OT, a great case to look at is the BTC attack in Turkey in 2008. 2 individuals walking along at night with a laptop turned off sensors on the pipeline, hyper-pressurized it, and blew it up. They had also hacked in and deleted over 60 hours of the video of that part of the pipeline. The video provided was of a camera of a local farmer who had a camera on his fields. So they knew that there were individuals with a laptop walking along. The impact of this is billions. Was it terrorism? Was it nation state? Was it a competitor that hired a criminal group? It was believed to be Russian oriented in terms of stability of Turkey. So many of us are familiar with the surface web. And then there's the deep web, and this is a picture borrowed from Deep Web Tech. And then there's the dark web. So a lot of people think this is the web and there's a little bit of this. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of dark websites for marketplaces and things like that. This is the stuff that's behind the corporate, the educational, that's connected to the internet but not exposed to search engines. There should be security here. There's absolutely security here. So for those, how many have been on the dark web? And still willing to raise your hands. That's kind of funny. OPSEC. The dark web marketplaces, if you've never been to one, remarkably look like eBay or Amazon. You can buy opioids, ecstasy, disassociatives, commit fraud, counterfeit items, digital products, jewels and gold, weapons, cards, other listings, software and malware, security and hosting, drugs and chemicals. You can hire an assassin. Now, your return rate on whether the assassin actually works or not, kind of questionable. But most of the time for a lot of the stuff in carding and malware, they rate the sellers And it's very, very much like it is a real business, a multi-trillion-dollar real business.
Very accurate.
Yes, it is. And you can rent a botnet, the Gosnim, for $1,500 US. You can rent the servers from them. You can full license, rental with support, telephone support included. Over here, you can get all the decryptors. Do you want Windows or other operating systems? Additional capabilities for $90 US a month. This is a business with call centers, with support desks, with requirements management. Imagine the Yakuza, the Italian mafia, the Russian gangs, all getting together for a requirement management meeting about the next botnet. Somebody's getting shot based on that requirement priority, so we'll go from there.
They say in the gold rush, the best way to make money is to sell shovels.
Yes, exactly. And that's a lot of the coders now are so far away in the organization from the actual use of the botnet, it's difficult to even get to them. Critical infrastructure, if you're familiar with the critical infrastructure components, what this translates to, was talking at various airports. We've had various attacks that have taken out airports around the world, be they intended to do so or as collateral damage. You've got Ukraine, Britain, and Spain had airports hit down by Petya. Fort McMurray got hit with ransomware. Ataturk in Turkey, targets of a coordinated attack for the passport control process. Warsaw for denial of service, and Vietnam for Chinese hacking groups. Also, we've had people hacking the natural gas pipelines within the United States. And guess what? How many of you knew TSA was in charge of that too? Not just free back rubs at the airport, they actually are in charge of oil and gas pipelines as well, and their security. So we already talked about BTC, and then we've had Atlanta, a city ransomed. In some cases, years and years of criminal court records, locked up and non-retrievable. We've also had a bunch of other cities hit in Canada and the United States with ransomware. This is going to sooner or later be deemed an act of national security interest. When you start ransoming hospitals and the day-to-day lives of American citizens or citizens of any country, the nation has to respond. Absolutely. And it's indiscriminate to a degree. So then the next couple of slides, I'm only going to show this one and then I'm going to fast forward through the rest. One of the things we do at the company I work for is we look out over all the insurance claims, all the trends, and we try and give senior leaders and national leaders what we think is going to occur each year, and then we go back and measure it. This is the Cliff Notes version of that for executives. The technology implementations are going to give huge new surface areas for problems. The supply chain, we're seeing code inserted earlier in the supply chain and problems. IoT, business operations, technical efficiencies are going to drive in new technology, new security problems. Insiders, employees are still big issue. And also the privileges you give an insider, if they get pwned, it's a privilege you give an outsider. Mergers and acquisitions, we've seen adversaries sitting in a company waiting for the acquisition. And then regulatory, you're going to get a lot more. If you think it's all about technology, it's all about compliance. So go find your chief risk officer, go make friends with them, and figure out how to explain what you need in budget to what they need. And the board of directors needs to be briefed on this. And this is where I go back to, you got to level it up, not dumb it down. You have to be the one person out of us, the collaborative us, that can stand on the board, tell them what they need to know, and not make them feel like they're being lectured to. Because then they'll get somebody else in your division to do it if they feel like you think they're idiots. Whether you do or not is a personal measure. Just don't let them know that. Level it up, talk in their terms, because they've been doing their profession for decades. So I'll go through these. There's one on each. If you're interested, let me know. I'll send you the particulars. And then the thing I'll stop on is, look, at the end of the day, somebody wants to buy a boat. I don't care what crime you're doing, what reason you're doing it for. There are patriots among them, but at the end of the day, most of the time, somebody wants to turn Bitcoin into money and buy a boat or a car or a DACA or a waterfront property. So what we need to do is team together, defend our countries, all of them around the world, and work to level it up to the boards of directors. Pending your questions, I really appreciate your time. Thank you. Questions? Shoot.
What do you know about the death of Hagler from Stoll's things? Have you read the,
No, I have not read about the death of Hagbard. I've been traveling, so I have to catch up on some of my.
no, this was from a long.
Which one is?
Stoll's so old that they were committed suicide.
Oh, the suicide. Oh, sorry, you're back on the Hanover Hackers. Okay. I only know what was released in the press. We got some data shared copies of it, but I'll leave it at that. Still 20 some odd years, so statute of limitations on that might be a little bit longer. But like I said, I've never read a suicide report that has as many inaccuracies. It was a homicide. I mean, that's just given. Nobody gets so distraught they commit suicide by driving into enemy territory and then torturing themselves. It just doesn't work that way. So.
It was on the 23rd, and he was the numbers. That number was big into his little trip he was on at the time. He was kind of involved with it. He was
Right.
obsessed with a particular book, and the number 23 was something out of that, kind of a reference. And so
Check.
It was interesting. Whoever managed to often managed to do it on the day and make it look like.
I don't know. I think the court dates were driving it more. There might have been some synergy there, but one of the things I've learned over time, and this may or may not be the case, people see patterns. Like, how many of you looked at clouds and seen a bunny rabbit? Like I have. You're not seeing a bunny rabbit. Your mind is thinking clouds look like bunny rabbits. There's no actual pattern there. I've seen people do that with data too. They'll take 2 or 3 data points and say, well, this is a pattern. Yeah, you could argue that, but statistically, it's still not a bunny rabbit. And so there's things where, having been involved, not in that case at that level at that time, because that preceded me by about 3 years. In other cases where somebody opines like, well, here's what they did, a lot of times we didn't have that kind of data, and they aren't as smart in making a conspiracy theory as we are in interpreting one.
Oh yeah, I just was curious to know if you knew anything more that had been reported by people who were in the papers and stuff.
No, there's been but after like 20 years, they did another look at it, I think. So they went back and looked at some of the stuff, but no, nothing unpublished. Sir.
Did you hear about the recent FSB data hack? Somebody has exfiltrated 7.5 terabytes out of the Russian Federal Service Bureau, which I know we've been hearing, like you say often, about all the stuff that leaked out of the U.S. government, but apparently the Russians just had a huge leak out of their service bureau.
One of my favorite books is the Mitrokin Archive. There was an archivist in the FSB and KGB that came out and had like oil drums filled with just data and information. And so counterespionage, one of the things that's the part of the NCIS I founded for the cyber side. They had a counterespionage department long before I got there. That's one of the issues. It's an issue faced by every nation around the world. And that's one where, and the Iranians had some of their stuff taken from their cyber group. There have been espionage agents, pro and con, all over the place. We read most likely about the ones that impact our home nation. The other ones we consider patriots to our flag if they're working for the US. But there's a bunch of cases where, I don't know, I always use Botswana. Botswana is, spying on Nigeria, and they have their own little stuff going too. But they face the same security problems we do in any regime, North Korean or otherwise. Sir?
Did you hear the stuff out of Jason Street with his, hacking and such?
Say again?
Jason E. Street and his work on things of just physical security and the idea of getting everybody into the security group.
I don't know if I've read his particular stuff. I mean, I've done on the physical penetration testing side, one of my favorite things is to go to a local dry cleaner to get badges for the building. You send a female operative in that says her husband forgot his badge on his dry cleaning, and they usually have a shoebox with all the company badges all over the place. So that's worked almost every time. On the physical security side, we have our pen test team. Oftentimes, a client will hire us, and they can, again, under legal contract with the client, Our people will be able to social engineer or just ghost in, get to a physical component of the network, install some stuff, walk out. We got them within a day or two.
Jason at one point walked out of a bank with their main processing machine.
Yeah.
Like, just powered off, walked it out, and it wasn't for like 30 seconds. Somebody went, wait a second, should we be walking away with that?
Yeah. And the 2 or 3 levels, and that's the thing is, a lot of times we're all enamored with the cybersecurity side, the physical security side, the insiders, personnel security, who's printing the documents, where your printer queue is, where it's being copied to. All of these things really matter, and a lot of them aren't sexy. They're basic network design. That means you have to talk to the physical security police about who's in the, whether the badges work after hours, where the badges get you to, is there granular controls. And that's the thing about being a cyber expert. Our expertise requires you to coordinate across those lines and understand those people's problems so you can bring them back into your design. And to your OPSEC point earlier from one of the people, if you can't suppress something about you, then you have to adjust your security program knowing that that's common knowledge. My resume for the first 10 years of my career, nobody knew who I was. I wasn't even on the internet. Like you could, first 10 years of the web, you could Google me, I wasn't there on purpose. Now, that's gone. So, and I got a LinkedIn profile and Facebook for my kids, those kind of things. So those are all known. Now I have to adjust my security program knowing that's the case.
He's got a fantastic talk titled Steal Everything, Kill Everyone, Steal Everything, Cause Financial Ruin.
That's the Marine Corps' manual.
Yes.
Yeah. Kill people and break stuff, yeah.
That apes it, that is basically, so what can you do when you just walk around in your slippers?
Yeah.
A lot. You can have contaminants that have caustic chemicals that shouldn't be mixed together right next to the air ventilation.
Yeah, there's at the companies that I consult with, a lot of times we'll start with an overall assessment with physical and information security. Sir, go ahead, sorry, you're patient.
Have you ever encountered hackers that were so good that they could use the same keyboard simultaneously?
Use 2 keyboards simultaneously?
The same keyboard simultaneously. It's like
Two people on one
NCIS.
keyboard.
It's NCIS. See.
The same keyboard simultaneously? No, no.
That's super cool.
Yeah, there's a couple of things, and Mudge Zatko, if you guys don't know Mudge, is Cult of the Dead Cow from back in the day. I worked with Mudge, and we laugh sometimes at the technical consulting. Mr. Robot's pretty good. They called a bunch of great people to keep that kind of legit, but it's not as flashy as, Enemy of the State or all the other things that we see. When I was training federal agents in the 90s, I would show them The Net with Sandra Bullock and the movie Hackers to show them what people think they do, and then I'd have to explain what the differences are, like what in the movie's real, what's not. Canceling the credit cards and having you declared dead, yeah, pretty easy. But some of this other stuff, not so much. So the harassment side.
So are you familiar with Bellingcat?
Say again?
What is it called? Bellingcat.
No, sorry.
They're a journalist, open source journalist researcher. They mostly go after both Russian agencies as well as Russian fraud, that kind of thing. Most recently, there was the poisonings that happened in London by supposedly Russian agents.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that one.
Okay.
So, talking about threat models and what you can do. So there was the handler for the agents who presumably did the poisoning. He used a burner phone, put in some fake name. Well, the Bellingcat people contacted some operatives they knew in Russia who worked for the telephone companies. There's the cell phone companies.
Right.
They convinced one of the cell phone guys who run their systems that, because he used a fake name, it's not really a real person. So could you please give us 2 years of cellular locational data for this GRU kernel?
Right.
And they wrote this really awesome article, and they basically tracked his movements every day for 2 years. To and from work, when he'd stop off, when he'd fly to London, when he took the train from London, from the airport to down here, when he met with the agents. It's crazy how much information you get from just your cell phone.
Right. But this is a good indicator when you talk about your adversary and think about your adversary. Your adversary is human. They have a limited budget. And even if you think they have an unlimited budget, most of it's going to some other part of the organization, not to the guy you're against. Same with companies. If you look at them like, wow, they earn $100 million a year. They can give me $4 million for their cybersecurity program. No, they can't. That guy doesn't, the CISO doesn't have that kind of budget. And the other thing I'll tell you is I solved more cases and caught more bad guys looking at psychology than I ever did technology. And if you want to try and be an espionage agent or survive a terrorist threat against you, do the following thing for the next 2 weeks. Drive to work, never taking the same route twice for 10 business days. You will stop after day 4. Because you're not allowed to stop at any Starbucks you've ever stopped at before. You're not allowed to cross any intersection you ever crossed before. Try it. You'll never do it. Which is why humans fall into patterns, and that's why we catch them. Again and again and again. Sir?
I read a fascinating interview with an NSA analyst who was talking about what he called fourth-party data collection.
Sorry, four-party data collection?
Fourth party.
Fourth-party data collection, okay.
And basically what he said is, I don't break into the person I want to listen. What I did is I went and looked and found for the criminals who'd broken into the facility, and then I broke into the criminals, and I watched what the criminals were doing, which meant that my hands were kind of clean. I didn't break into the Russians or the Chinese. I broke into the hackers who broke into the other group, and so therefore, I was watching everything because somebody else was stealing all their data, and I was watching copies.
I understand what you mean by fourth party. I wouldn't call it clean. I would just call it a different kind of dirty, but okay.
Yeah,
I mean, I get your point.
Yeah. Basically, it's deniable in the sense that I didn't break into the innocence.
So let's differentiate. Legally, no, it's not. Morally, I don't even think you got good grounds there. However, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a great discussion to have, but you're not legally clean in any way. You're still violating every law known to man. You're potentially picking on a worse adversary if you're picking on a criminal organized crime group. I'd rather probably have the wrath of the victim than the wrath of the organized crime group, personally speaking. Yeah, but I get what you mean, is that it might be easier for you and you might get a larger group of information, but I think it actually might be more perilous to the individual themselves.
So what does your company do?
Sure. Usually so I'll do this one. So I work for a company called, one of the people asked just for the thing, what my company does. Strauss Freeburg. Strauss Freeburg is a company none of you probably know, founded by Ed Strauss and Eric Freeburg, an FBI agent and an AUSA from New York about 10 years ago. Every hack you've read about in the papers, we've probably done about 80% of them. The Yahoo hack, Facebook hired us for Cambridge Analytica. I can only say that because they released a press release to that effect. The Marriott hacks years ago. We testified in the Uber, Google, Waymo discussion of intellectual property theft for autonomous vehicles. In fact, on the internet, Exhibit 22 had been released, not by us, shows about how Strauss did the forensics, including the people who stole the data saying, make sure to delete your text messages each night because Strauss Freeburg might find them. And it's in our report. Another one is the date time stamp of the reformatting of the hard drive of the individual when the court ordered them to provide their laptop. They reformatted it while they were sitting in our waiting room. And we have the date time stamp for that. So there's a lot of things. So we do a lot. We're known a lot for e-discovery, expert witness testimony, things like that. What people don't know is we also do all the things on the front end to keep you from having those problems. Testing. We acquired Gotham Digital Sciences, or GDS, a group of about 50 of the world's preeminent pen testers. Now, there are a bunch of groups of 50 of the most world's preeminent pen testers. GDS is a pretty good one on that list. We also do tabletops advisory, design, security policy standards, things to that effect. Strauss is a part of Aon, which is a 50,000 person insurance company. And the final thing I'll tell you is why I took a position at an insurance company. If you're a student of history, as most of us in the community are, steam factories were killing people around the turn of the century by blowing up because they were overpressuring. And you see these pictures of these locomotives that were basically in a steam factory and it blows up, kills like 200 people. A company called HSB, an insurance company, Hartford Steam Boiler, said if you want to have a steam factory anywhere near residence, you have to have this piece of architecture called a Hartford steam loop that relieves the pressure so it won't blow up. So the insurance company told you, and I'm using a technical term, what kind of architecture you have to have if you want insurance. 50 years forward, seat belts were put in cars, not because car manufacturers like seat belts, because insurance companies demand them, and airbags, and crumple zones, and other things. Here's what's happening in cyber. Stuff is blowing up in neighborhoods and hurting people. Insurance companies are going to be telling CISOs what technology statistically, globally, stops stuff from blowing up. And I took this job as a global, to see that global trend. And the final thing I'll leave you with is, look, it's easy to talk about threats, vulnerabilities, IT. We need to talk about diplomacy, mission, business, impacts. We need to be the people that level it up. We need to be the people that bring the mystique of cyber back into the core of our lives, of our businesses, to protect our countries, our companies, and our families. Thanks a lot for your time, and thanks for those on the web broadcast.